Okay, so in this Running Man example, we're going to expand on your knowledge of oscillators even more. So there's actually no animation that's baked into the characters. They're running around in a circle purely based on oscillators, giving them this movement. The character is actually running in place. And then we're also going to use gradients and some other things we haven't done before to finalize this effect. So again, even if this particular effect isn't that exciting to you, I recommend that you stick around because you're going to learn techniques and workflows that will help you in the future. So inside of Mixamo, you just need a running humanoid character. It could be any of these people over here. Just set the overdrive again all the way to 0, so he's running slow, and check in place so that he's actually running in one spot instead of moving forward. That's very important. And so inside of Embergen, again starting with a blank scene, I'll just say import and import mine Running Man. Here he is running really fast. So again, override FPS, set it to maybe, that's too slow, so let's try 10. Okay, that's better. Let's change the color to pure white, enable volumetric shading, and let's adjust the size of our grid. It's way too big, so we can maybe do just 50 on the Z, apply new resolution. And so the cool thing is that Embergen lets you change the pivot of the model. So I can just maybe move the pivot on the X, and so the center gizmo is still in here. So if I hit W and rotate, I can still rotate him this way. So actually, in order for this to work for us, we need to move him on the Y, right? So that now when I rotate him, he's gonna be running in a circle just like we want him to. So notice I'm rotating him on the Z axis over here. So I'll just double click to expose the rotation pin, drag out from that, and we wanna do a modulator cycle. Now I don't want anything on the X axis or the Y axis. I just want him to be spinning on the Z axis. So it's already working, it's just way too fast. So we can just lower the frequency on the Z to maybe 0.01. All right, so it's almost working, except he's running backwards. I had to pause the video and think about it for a bit, and what I found is the only way to really fix it is to click auto pivot, which will bring the pivot back to the center of the character. And we need to essentially rotate him 90 degrees so that he's facing the other way. So I'll just double click to get rid of the pin, reset everything to 0, rotate him 90 degrees on the Z. Now I can move the pivot away from him, and I can double click to expose the rotation, plug it into my cycle, and now he's running forward. 0.02 maybe we can do. And now he's running pretty fast. And I can still go back to the import, and I can move the pivot further or closer away from him to sort of expand or shrink the radius of how far he's running away from the center. I still feel like his feet are moving a bit too fast considering how fast he's spinning. So we can change the FPS to maybe 7 to 0.01. And now we can do everything we're used to, so maybe emit some particles out of him. So out of geometry, I'll make a new emitter particles, plug it into my emitter over here. And so now I have a nice particle trail being created behind this guy. But what I want to do is create these ghosts. So this is a similar technique that we used with the letter S. We're once again going to use an oscillator to only give birth to these particles every few frames. We already know how to do that. So I can just double click on the emission rate to expose this. And I want to do a modulator oscillator. I want the base to be 0. And I want the amount to go all the way to a few 100,000 particles every few seconds. So let's set this to maybe 300%. And I'll just change this to be a pulse. So we are almost there. It's shooting all the way up to like 1,000,000 particles. That's too much. So I'll lower this back down to maybe 150%. So we have 300,000 particles created. And now we just need to create that custom waveform like we did before. So I'll just set this to custom and draw these few points over here like we did with the letter S. This should really be a very thin sort of spike. Awesome. So now I'm giving birth to these ghosts behind him, but it's just happening way too often So now I can just start lowering the frequency and they will only be created every once in a while. Cool, so maybe 0.5 for the frequency. And we can go into the particles active forces and lower the gravity to maybe just 1 instead of 10. So they're falling down, but just very, very slowly. And I also want to increase their lifetime. So life, let's crank this up to maybe 12 seconds. So maybe from 9 to 12 seconds. And we're getting these nice ghosts. Now, if you want 2 of these guys, you can just easily copy this import node, Control C, Control V, link the geometry to your emitter, and link the rotation to the modulator. But now you have 2 of them on top of each other, and you can't modify the rotation anymore because it's plugged into the modulator. So we need to double click to unlink this, copy the modulator, Control V, link that to our second character. And now I can go into the modulator and change the phase. So I can just set it to 90. And now they are exactly 90 degrees apart in the cycle of things. So I can increase the lifetime of these particles even more so that it closes the loop. So emitter particles, I'll extend their lifetime even more. So maybe let's go from 12 to 15 seconds. That's better. We can go even more. Let's crank it up to 20 seconds. So maybe from 17 to 20. And now we can just make this look a little bit better with some colors. So rendering. Let's make them emissive this time because why not? And additive. I'll lower their emissive boost so they're lit up just a little bit. I also definitely want them to get small before they die. Shape, set this to cosine, and they are born small and they gradually get smaller before they die as well. Lower their size to maybe just 55%. And I'm not sure if additive is the best way here. Maybe lit additive is better. I think it is. And so now we can play with the colors. So for the initial color, let's just say cycle with time. Double click to expose the curve. And now we can plug in our own color gradient over here. And I will just create a bunch of colors on the spectrum to give it that rainbow look. Red and finally pink. So we have our little rainbow over here. Let's go back into the settings and lower the cycle duration. And as you lower that, they should now start being born with a different color every time they're born because the cycle is very short, maybe too short right now. We're getting some colors mixed together. So just, play around with this until you get it nice and clean. And then if you want to get rid of the gradient between the colors, you can just set it to constant. So this is basically my final result that I had before. If you wanted to make it even a bit more cooler as to how the particles dissipate, you could create a new emitter volume. So let me just plug them into a emitter volume and the second person as well. Plug that into your emitter. So now they're generating some smoke and fire, but we only want smoke. So turn off fuel, turn off temperature. Let's set the velocity transfer to maybe just 20% so they don't mess up all the smoke so fast. Or actually, let's just set the velocity transfer to 0. Otherwise, the silhouette of the person will always be messed up. And we need this smoke to be born in the exact same time as the particles are born. So I will actually enable the pin override for the smoke rate, copy this oscillator that we created for the particles, and plug that into my smoke rate. So now there's a bunch of smoke created in the exact same time as the particles are created. And you can see how the smoke is already beautifully advecting the particles and making them dissipate in a much cooler way than they were before. That's exactly what I was after. So, this is not bad. They're dissipating nicely in place, but we can add just a touch of buoyancy to them so they start rising up ever so slowly. So in the simulation force, let's set the buoyancy to 0.02, maybe 0.1 for the buoyancy. And now the particles are beautifully rising up while being advected by the smoke. And now, last touch, I actually want to hide the smoke because I only want to see the GPU particles. The only purpose of the smoke is to advect the particles nicely. So we can go into the shading node and you can just simply uncheck render smoke. And here you go. You're left with just the particles beautifully dissolving. Now I think we could do with even more particles. So for the emitter oscillator, we can crank up the amount to maybe 200%. So we have still only around 250,000 particles in the scene at any given time. That's completely manageable. And here you go. This is pretty cool. The power of oscillators, so many cool effects you can make with this stuff. And I'll see you in the next video for another example.